All right, now on to part two of the presentation on Thomas Hurka's article, The Justification of National Partiality. Um, so we're going to look at the second two parts of his article, the two components of just what nationalism or patriotism consists in, and then he's going to justify one of those components. All right, so before we get to his, I guess, two components of where the partiality in nationalism consists, I'd just make the note that if you're going to be able to evaluate the justification of nationalism, partiality, or patriotism, you actually have to, specifically if you want to evaluate the justification of the partiality involved in it, you have to know exactly where the partiality lies. So just as I stressed and lectured about how McIntyre goes through these pains to define patriotism, well, this is kind of what Hurka is doing as well. He's going to do it slightly differently, as we'll see. But it's important that he do this, and it's important that we understand just why he's doing this and what he has in mind. So he defines, so I say starting at the end. So he kind of gives an argument, and then he kind of reaches this conclusion of what the two components are. So we're just going to start there, and then work our way back for a second. So Hurka defines full-blooded nationalism as 1. The greater concern for the survival and flourishing of one's own culture, and 2. Their greater concern for the survival and flourishing of one's co-nationals. For example, your fellow Americans. All right. Well, let's take a look at 1. Cultural. Concern for the survival and flourishing of your culture. Let's take a look at that first. So, Hurka is going to claim that the survival of a culture, like, I don't know, Indiana or Midwestern culture, it's an impersonal good. What does he mean by that? Well, he says it's a good that is not reducible to the goods of individual persons or goods located in individual persons' lives. So, it's not like the sum is just identical with the parts, I guess. Uh, so, for example, it's something that's kind of over and above the parts. So, just for example, your house is constructed out of a bunch of bricks that are 2 by 4, 2 inches by 4 inches by 4 inches, for example. It doesn't follow that your house is 2 inches by 4 inches by 4 inches. It's got a different set of dimensions. It's although in a sense that is reducible because you could add up all the dimensions of the bricks. So again, it's not a perfect analogy. But here's another example. So the surface of a table is smooth and flat, right? Well, if you were able to get a high-powered microscope and look at the molecular structure of the table, you wouldn't see something that's flat and smooth. You'd see something that's kind of jagged. Molecules aren't flat like that. So the surface of the table, in a sense, is over and above, or not reducible, perhaps, to the geometrical features of the molecules that constitute it. Again, that's another imperfect analogy, but it'll suffice for now. So that's what he's going to argue about culture as well. It's an impersonal good that's not reducible to individual persons. All right. So, for example, Francophone Quebecers care about the survival and flourishing of their French culture, not in the sense that the disappearance of French culture in Francophone Quebec would be like literally morally bad for the individuals in it. Instead, according to Hurka, it would be better if French culture survived, even if it would not make their individuals' lives more valuable. That's what he's claiming. I wish Hurka would have said more about this. Unfortunately, he doesn't. I think more could be said about it. I just wish Hurka would have done the work for us, since it seems to be part of his argument. But we'll just move on for now. So he distinguishes between the existence of a culture and the good of a culture. Two different things. So the existence of a culture is reducible to facts about individual persons. It depends. The existence of a culture, in a sense, depends on there being individuals. However, he's going to say that the goodness of a culture is not reducible to the goods of individuals in the way that the existence of a culture is reducible to the existence of individuals. And that is one way he argues that cultural survival is an impersonal good. Okay. So he's going to claim that cultural survival is valued in a highly partial way by nationalists or by patriots. So, for example, I am Davis, and I live in Indiana right now. I value the survival of Francophone Quebecian culture a whole lot less than a Francophone Quebecer. And if you are a Francophone Quebecer, you probably value it a whole lot more than I do. So that's the sense in which there's this partiality involved in cultural survival. I care less about that than, um, yeah, just like I care less about Icelandic culture than an Icelandic person does. Doesn't mean I don't care necessarily. It just means that the Icelandic persons probably are valued a lot more than I do. They're more partial towards it. Okay. Well, there's that second component that I mentioned. Um, the greater concern for the survival and flourishing of your co-nationals, and that's concern for people. So, Hurka writes, and I quote, "There is no doubt that one ought morally to care about one's co-nationals. They are people, and one ought in general to care about people, so that's trivial. The difficulty, however, is to show why one should care more about these people, your co-nationals, like your fellow Americans, than about others who are not members of your nation. Or, why partiality towards this particular group is appropriate." All right, so here's some reasons against showing this partiality towards your co-nationals. So for one, membership in your nation is generally non-voluntary. Most of you became American citizens just by in virtue of being born here. It's not like you had a say in that. So it's non-voluntary. Well, membership in race is also non-voluntary. It's not like you're in heaven and an angel asks you before you're born, what race would you like to be? And then you pick a race and you're born in that race. It's just you're born into it non-voluntarily. You don't have a say in it. And the non-voluntariness of race is one reason why we say that this partiality, that race is a non-morally relevant feature of individual persons. So there's no moral appraisal that you could give to race. It's not relevant. You can give a moral appraisal to certain traits like bravery or cowardice. Those are moral traits. Race is not a moral trait, so it's morally irrelevant. Well, membership in a nation is generally non-voluntarily, just like membership in a race is non-voluntary. So people say that to the extent that membership in race is morally irrelevant, so is membership in a nation. Okay, that's a powerful argument. Second, Canadians, this is an example. Canadians near the Michigan border, there's a good chance they identify a lot more with Americans in Michigan near that border than they would with Francophone Quebecers. So you live a mile above Michigan, and 2 miles away is your buddy that lives in America, and you guys go ice fishing together. You probably have a lot more in common with that person than you do with someone in like Quebec, in Montreal, for example. So mere nationality is far less of a tie than, geographic vicinity, for example. So that's a point that Hurka brings up. Third, I know family members, and we're often tightly knit with our family members. Okay. We're not tightly knit that way with our co-nationals. I'm a lot closer to my family than I am with other Americans. And the fact that their family is a reason why I am as close knit with them. So those are three reasons that kind of count against partiality towards your co-nationals. So that's a fairly big burden for Hurka to overcome, especially since he's not going to be relying on this embedded selves ethic. Okay, well, let's see how he responds to it. Well, before we do that, let's look at some examples of where we do show partiality towards co-nationals. And I brought this up in the last lecture. We hear this in political debates all the time. We all, on both sides of the political spectrum, right and left, generally, for various causes. So here's an example. We care more about relieving economic hardships and promoting economic flourishing within our own country than with others. We get mad at these greedy corporations for building factories in third world countries so they can pay people a lot less because it's taking jobs from Americans. Okay, so that's an example. 2, immigration policy is usually decided based on its impact on people already within the nation rather than the people who want to join. If we found out that easing restrictions on immigration would cause 20 million Americans to lose their jobs, that would probably count against that in the legislation when the legislators were deciding on that. Whereas if easing immigration restrictions gave 1 million immigrants, non-nationals, jobs, that would not weigh as strongly as the impact on the people within the nation. So now neither of these 2 points justify partiality towards co-nationals, but they are examples of the fact that we do assume it oftentimes. Okay, so when then does the partiality towards certain individuals? When is partiality towards certain individuals individual is justified. So here's what he's going to do. He's going to look at examples of, I mentioned this in the first lecture. Actually, I mentioned this earlier. He's going to look at examples in which, say, partiality is justified. And then you get out your philosophical microscope and you look for the features that justify that. And then you zoom out and then you look at the partiality we show towards our co-nationals and see if that same feature holds. And if it does, then you could probably say it's justified. So let's see. So let's find out what, according to Hurka, those features are. Those, he says, certain relations that hold when partiality is justified. And his example will be family. So there's partiality towards family members is justified. And he's gonna give an explanation of what he thinks those relations are. Well, I said, what are those relations? Before we get to that, Hurka is going to say one is something that co-nationals have to a much less of a degree than family members. So to that extent, it's not going to be justified. But there's another one that they have about as much that will be justified. So, a caveat. Man, I'm just teasing you guys right now. I don't get to my point. I just keep getting all these caveats and presuppositions. Well, welcome to philosophy. I apologize. So he also gives two caveats. One, a presupposition of his argument is that the basis of partiality is objective rather than a subjective relation. So the basis of the partiality that is justified is objective rather than a subjective relation. So it's not simply that co-nationals care more about each other than other non-nationals. That would be subjective. Because if simply caring was sufficient, then the fact that races care more about members of their own race than others would make it right. But of course, it is not right. So it's got to be objective, not subjective. All right, so in arguing that it's defensible that partiality towards co-nationals is justified, he gives an analogy with his partiality that he shows towards his wife. So we're going to learn something about love today, everyone. You took a class on global ethics and you're going to learn about love. Maybe this will help you with your own life. College is great. So, Hurka gives an analogy with his wife. He loves his wife because A, certain qualities she possesses, and B, him and his wife have a shared history. Now he's going to argue neither A nor B is sufficient in and of itself. It's got to be the conjunction, both A and B, that justifies his partiality that he shows towards his wife in contrast with others. Okay. So, for example, if Hurka loved his wife only because of certain qualities she had, such as her musical talents, that alone wouldn't justify his partial love towards her. Because, well, lots of people have those qualities, so he should show love towards them all, right? But that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about the partiality you show towards a family member or a spouse, for example. All right. However, a shared history also isn't sufficient. For if his wife lost some of those qualities, so she went from being caring to extremely selfish and dishonest, for example, well, the shared history probably just wouldn't suffice to justify the partiality he shows towards her. Unfortunately, that happens. We've all dated someone that changed for the worse, right? Okay. Well, not much needs to be said. I think that's pretty straightforward. So let's connect the analogy with his wife towards partiality towards your co-nationals, your fellow citizens. So appreciating cultural features is necessary but not sufficient, for one can appreciate other cultures' features as well. You can recognize them as good. So I recognize the goods that come with Francophone Quebec. Even though I'm not a Francophone Quebec, I don't see. I can read some French, but I can't speak it or anything. I'm not from Quebec. I'm from North Carolina. Okay, but having a shared history is also necessary but not sufficient. All right, here's an example. If a nation loses some of those good features that it originally had, so Germany, for example, in World War II, when the Nazis took power, it doesn't matter if you have a shared history with them. If you're a German, your partiality towards it at that point would not be justified. So the partiality would no longer be justified in spite of a long shared history because those features have changed. Okay, so you got to have both. Both are sufficient. Both are necessary, and they're jointly sufficient. Okay, so lastly, Hurka says there's an analogy and a disanalogy. Remember I said that national partiality scores really high on one dimension and really low on another. So it scores low in comparison to familial history with respect to the closeness of contact. And I mentioned this earlier. So there's a lack of closeness of contact with your co-nationals that is present in family members. I don't really feel that much of an affinity towards Americans I run to the airport. But if I ran into a family member, I would. Two, a nation's history, on the other hand, does score pretty well in another dimension, the production of good, being proud of certain achievements. So Hurka is proud of his healthcare system. Okay, well, that's Hurka's basic argument.